Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Flagler Museum on behalf of the trustees and the staff. My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for the third in our series of lectures, the Whitehall Lecture Series. This year's theme is the unlikely titans of industry and commerce, and today's lecture will be on Henry Ford. Let me just take a couple of minutes to remind you to turn off your cell phones, to make sure your cell phones are turned off. These lectures are recorded and archived and also live streamed, so if by chance you're not able to join us in person, you can always join us on a Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock via the internet anywhere you are in the world. Let's see, what else do I need to remind you of? Oh yeah, our sponsor. Our sponsor for this year's lecture series is Related, a developer here in the area that owns most of the Class A office space in West Palm Beach, and they've just launched a program called Related Together, which is a program that it hopes to achieve economic development in West Palm Beach for some of the underserved communities. Let's see, today's lecture is by Stephen Watts. Dr. Watts has been at the University of Missouri for a number of years, I guess about 3 decades, and he just retired, if I'm remembering correctly. A little more than 3 decades, he just raised his thumb, where he taught a variety of history classes, and he's written a number of books on people like Walt Disney, Dale Carnegie, Hugh Hefner. I think you just finished one on Will Rogers, which that ought to be interesting. So, but he's here today to talk about Henry Ford. And there'll be books at the back of the room if you care to purchase his book on Ford, and I'm sure he'd be happy to sign it. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Watts to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
All right. Well, thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. I am delighted to be here at the Flagler to speak today for a couple of reasons, really. One, it's a great honor to be included in this very distinguished lecture series, so thanks for inviting me. Secondly, I have to confess I'm delighted to be here because of the god-awful winter we've had back in the Midwest this year. I was telling them at lunch that I guess it's been about 3 weeks ago now, we got hit by an Arctic blast for about 10 days. The temperatures were between 0 and 10 during the day and 0 and 10 below during the night. We live on a farm. We have horses and dogs. They were frozen. We have chickens. They were frozen. We lived there. We were frozen. And I still haven't quite thawed out from all of that, so it's really a delight to be down here in the warm weather. Even if it's a little bit rainy today, that's completely okay. Well, this afternoon I want to discuss for a little while the career, the significance, and the legacy of Henry Ford, someone who is, I think, arguably one of the 2 or 3 most influential figures in the shaping of modern American life as we still lead it today. And I want to begin with a story. In 1928, on the 20th anniversary of the launch of the Model T automobile, Henry Ford created a public uproar, as he liked to do on occasion. He was being interviewed by the Associated Press about his life and career, and they asked about the secret to success as he saw it. And Ford said that the old traditional formula of hard work and saving money was pretty good, but it was really only half right. He said the part about working hard was still good, but the part about saving money, he said, was just nonsense. It was fruitless. Successful people did not save money, Ford said, but, and these are his words, they spent it as fast as they could for things to improve themselves. Well, notice of this quickly went out through the country, and there was a great controversy that erupted about what the newspapers called Henry Ford's gospel of spending. And supporters of his position sort of acclaimed his argument that these old Victorian ideals of thrift, self-denial, it was time to throw those in the waste can. But opponents of Ford denounced what he had said as being a kind of dangerous assault on the virtues of thrift and prudence, which were still quite necessary, they believed. Well, Ford's associates and those who followed his career, however, were not really surprised, I think, at what he had argued. Let's see if I can get this up here. Yeah. There we go. Anyway, those who know Ford quite well were not surprised at his expression of this sentiment. They knew that Ford deeply believed in the virtues of hard work, but they also knew that he believed deeply in what he saw as the virtues of purchasing and the necessity of leisure and the necessity of manufacturers responding to the wants of consumers. And this enjoyment of material goods, Ford had said actually throughout his career, led to contentment, it led to new experiences, and it led to a richer life. And moreover, Ford believed that at the center of this new ethic in American life was the automobile, particularly the Model T, which is pictured here coming out of the Highland Park factory in Dearborn, his first big factory, by the thousands in the early 20th century. Ford believed that the automobile was at the key, or at a key juncture anyway, of this new kind of society. And his words were these, and again I quote, he said, "By enabling people to get about quickly and easily, it gives them a chance to find out what's going on out in the world. And this leads to a larger life that requires more food, more and better goods, more books, more music, more of everything." As a close associate of Ford's once noted, he said his boss understood that his life's work was, quote, "a mission to demonstrate the superiority of an economy of abundance over one of scarcity, and to begin the elevation of a standard of living to a height never before dreamed of." Well, here's a Henry Ford that we are little acquainted with, I would suggest. The Henry Ford that most of us know, the one that we meet in our history textbooks, goes something like this. It begins with Henry Ford, the man who in the mid-1890s built the quadricycle, here pictured motoring around on the streets of New York with its tiny little engine and its bicycle tires that you might note. The Henry Ford we know is also the man who pioneered the assembly line at his factory up in the Detroit area, where tremendous efficiencies of production were achieved by bringing the work to the workers instead of the workers to the work in Ford's classic formulation. Still later, the Ford we meet in the textbooks is the one who built the mammoth River Rouge automobile plant out on the Detroit River, where raw iron ore came in one end of this enormous complex and completed automobiles came out of the other. The Ford we know, the Ford we're familiar with, was a manufacturer, a maker of goods, a kind of hard-scrabble businessman whose genius for efficiency created unprecedented production in American industrial life. Henry Ford, the familiar one, was a producer who put America on wheels and created the automobile-centered society of highway systems, of suburban life, of suburbs, of service industries surrounding the automobile, all the things we know that really are the kind of skeleton of how we still live life today in American society. Now, all these traditional images, I would admit, ring true, I think at least in part. But the familiar Ford, the one I've just described, I would insist, is really just a shadow of the man that I noted at the very outset of my remarks. the cultural innovator who talked about spending and consumer abundance and self-improvement. This Ford shaped new values, a new definition of America, really, that, like the automobile, I think still holds sway in our society up to the present time. He is, I think, the essential Henry Ford that I want to discuss with you for a while this afternoon. Now, Ford, as some of you may know, had a fascinating and a multifaceted life. And this is something that still astounds me. Henry Ford was born during the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War, but he lived to see the dropping of the atomic bomb and the beginning of the Cold War in the late 1940s, kind of an astonishing span of time. He grew up on a farm outside of Detroit, Michigan, and this is the kind of modest farmhouse that he had reconstructed later on. His parents, pictured here, William Ford, a fairly prosperous, a progressive farmer in the Detroit area. His mother, Mary Litigott Ford, grew up really a kind of standard rural upbringing, I think, for a kid in this time period. And here we have the first known picture that we have of Henry Ford at about age 2.5. A great hat. I always loved the hat. But Henry Ford, again, it's kind of typical rural upbringing in this period, except for one thing. It became a kind of standing joke in the Ford family that Henry Ford hated farm work, especially horses. He hated horses throughout his life. He hated the grind of farm labor. He wouldn't do it. His parents had to make him. He sort of groused about it constantly. He was much more interested in mechanical things, in tinkering. And he spent most of his time repairing watches, for example, at a workbench that he set up in his home. And he spent a lot of other time sort of looking at and peering into the new steam-powered farm machines that were beginning to appear for the first time in the late 19th century in the rural areas of the country. In 1879, at age 16, Ford did something that everybody expected. He left the farm and he headed into Detroit, which was about 15 miles away, where he took a series of jobs at machine shops and crude manufactories in that period. And as shown in this photograph, as a young man, he would be seen cycling around the streets of Detroit to his various jobs on his bicycle. In 1891, and he was now married to a young woman, Clara Bryant Ford, he found really his first good job when he was hired as an engineer and a machinist at the Edison Illuminating Company in the city, a company that was responsible for bringing electricity to a good part of the urban population. And spent his days there. He is the gentleman, by the way, to the left with the mustache with a couple of his co-engineers at the Illuminating Company. But more importantly, in the long run, Henry Ford, in the evenings, had begun to spend hours and hours working on something that he had read about in machinist magazines that he subscribed to. And that is this notion of developing an internal combustion engine that would power something that people had begun to refer to as a horseless carriage. And Ford began to develop one of his own. He began to tinker with it in a garage behind the house that he rented with his wife. And on Christmas Eve in 1893, he successfully fired up his one-cylinder engine, gasoline engine, for the very first time. He got it to work. A little over 2 years later, after a lot more tinkering, he successfully launched the quadricycle, which I had shown in an earlier slide here, from that garage behind his house. And the legendary story, which is true, by the way, is that in 1896, he and a friend of his put the finishing touches on the quadricycle. They went to wheel it out into the street. And to their horror, they saw that they had forgot to think about how to get it out the door because they'd been building it inside. It was too big. So Henry Ford literally grabbed a sledgehammer and had to knock out the bricks around the door of the garage to get the thing out and get it going in the company, or rather in the street. Well, over the next several years, Henry Ford tried on 2 separate occasions to manufacture an automobile, to get a company up and going. Both of those attempts were failures. They just didn't get off the ground at all. In 1903, however, he secured some investors who poured enough money into his effort that he was able to found the Ford Motor Company in 1903. For the first 3 or 4 years of the company, they developed a couple of prototypes of the automobile that sold modestly well. But in 1908, the Ford Motor Company hit the jackpot. Because in 1908, really from Ford's idea, they put out on the market the Model T automobile, which was a tremendous success, as I'm sure many of you know, in American life. This is one of the very first advertisements in 1908 for the early version of the Model T, and this car basically took the country by storm. It immediately, as an inexpensive vehicle, sturdy, long-lasting, began to sell tens of thousands out there to the public, and over the next several years, well up into the mid-1920s, sold millions of numbers to American consumers. And with the Model T, I think it's fair to say the country was never quite the same. Well, as Ford became rich as an automobile manufacturer with the Model T and the Ford Motor Company, he began to enter the public arena in a number of different ways, and his career became very multifaceted in quite a number of areas. For example, Ford in the 19-teens became probably the most well-known pacifist in the United States. During World War I, he actively opposed the war when it got up and going, and he spent thousands and thousands of his own dollars to rent an ocean liner, which he called the Peace Ship. And here was a photo that was taken of him standing at the rail. And the Peace Ship, he loaded up with anti-war activists, and they sailed off to Europe to try to stop World War I. Well, no great surprise, this didn't work out too well. Journalists and critics sort of immediately termed this enterprise the good ship Nettie, as one of them called it, and it failed miserably. And Ford sort of slunk off the ship in Europe and came home. In 1918, in a kind of another departure, Ford ran for the Senate. Let's try this again here. There we go. In 1918, Ford ran for the Senate, was convinced to do so as a Democrat in that year. And although he barely moved a finger to campaign for that office, he lost by just a whisker to his Republican opponent. Over the next several years, there was a kind of groundswell of support for Henry Ford to run for president. He was very, very popular. But what sort of killed that was his wife. Clara Ford, who I think knew her husband better than he probably knew himself, sensed that this would have been an utter disaster. And she did an interview in which she said if Henry actually ran for president, she was going to move to England. And no great surprise, Henry withdrew from consideration a few days later. Ford also, in his kind of multifaceted career in this period, emerged as a reformer, kind of a cultural reformer in a number of different areas. He became a kind of outspoken health reformer. He was an opponent of alcohol consumption. He was an opponent of smoking and tobacco. He wrote and had published a kind of long pamphlet which he entitled The Case Against the Little White Slaver, which was his name for cigarettes. He was also, I guess we would say, a kind of physical fitness nut. He rode his bicycle and he ran foot races with his friends well up into his 70s. And he promoted vegetarian diets throughout his life as well, some of them quite extreme. Well, in the 1930s, Ford re-engaged with politics, with the Great Depression and the New Deal. Ford became a strident critic of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal in the 1930s. He believed that the New Deal, Roosevelt's big political program for recovery, was something that was poisoning individual initiative. It was something, in Ford's view, was transforming too many people into wards of the state. And in this photo here, Roosevelt visited one of Ford's factories in the 1930s, and Ford didn't want to do it. He was more or less forced to ride in the back seat of this automobile with FDR in a tour of the plant, and FDR was his usual effusive, personable self. And as you can get a little hint of there, Ford was kind of sitting in the back of the automobile, looking quite uncomfortable and a little grouchy about the whole thing. He didn't really like FDR at all. At the very same time in the 30s, in concert with this, Ford became a bitter opponent of unionization that was beginning to sweep through the automobile industry, including the Ford Motor Company. Ford bitterly opposed the United Auto Workers, who were trying to organize auto laborers at Ford Motor Company. And this led to a series of very, I would have to say, sort of disastrous encounters at his automobile plants in Detroit, where basically Ford hired people to sort of beat up union organizers at his plant. This is a photo that was taken at the famous, what became known as the Battle of the Overpass, where a number of these sort of Ford company thugs, I would have to call them, attacked the organizers for the UAW and sort of beat them to a pulp during this encounter. Eventually, I should note, Ford relented about all of this because of economic pressures and eventually signed an agreement with the UAW, but he wasn't very happy about it. Well, the 1930s also saw, however, some happier projects in Ford's life. First of all, he and his staff scientists up in Dearborn turned to the soybean, which has become a kind of staple of American agriculture, but Ford was the guy who really got soybeans up and running as a kind of profitable cash crop for farmers in American life. He and his engineers also developed, as we see in this photo here, there we go. The Ford Ferguson tractor, which Henry Ford envisioned as sort of the Model T of farm implements for small and medium-sized farmers. And Ford believed these kinds of innovations, which he pioneered, would be very helpful to the agricultural part of the United States, who were suffering terribly, many of them during the Great Depression. Ford, you may also be interested to know, was a kind of pioneer in developing vocational schools in Detroit and in Michigan. He poured millions of his own dollars into these new kinds of schools which he established, which combined regular curricular learning on the one hand with vocational training on the other, and sort of for good measure threw in a lot of moral instruction for the children as well. And these schools became very popular. They were sort of part John Dewey and part McGuffey's Reader, I guess, in this period. Now, Ford's private life throughout his career, I think, was almost as complex and interesting as his public life. He enjoyed a long, stable marriage with Clara Bryant Ford, And here they're depicted as one of their favorite activities, dancing. Ford was a big host of dances at the Ford complex up there, and they spent many hours at this favorite endeavor. Claire Bryant was sort of a pillar of support, I think, for Henry Ford throughout his career, particularly during the last decade of his life, when, as an old man, he suffered a series of strokes that really made him a kind of uncomprehending figure in his own company. And these strokes were, of course, carefully hidden from the public in order to protect the company and its values. But at the same time, while Ford had a long 50-year marriage to Clara Ford, the evidence is pretty clear that he had a decades-long affair with a much younger woman, which resulted in the birth of an illegitimate son in the 1920s. And it also produced a curious situation where neither myself nor anyone else who has studied Ford was able to figure out. On Henry Ford's deathbed in 1947, the first person that his wife Clara summoned to his deathbed was his mistress. So they were both there. So go figure. The great tragedy, I think, though, of Henry Ford's private life was his relationship with his son, Edsel, pictured here. This photo was taken in the late 1920s when they released the new Model A car, which was the successor to the Model T. Henry, throughout his son's life, he wanted Edsel to be a kind of carbon copy of himself, resilient, shrewd, hard-driving, focused. But the son, from a very early age, was sort of cut from a different bolt of cloth. He was genteel, he was interested in art and music, he was very cooperative and team-oriented in his sensibility. Henry Ford installed Edsel as the president of Ford Motor Company around 1920, and then he pushed his son relentlessly to be tough in that position. But the method he chose to do that was rather sad in hindsight. He undercut Edsel every decision he made, making it clear that he, Henry, was the guy really in charge of everything. He tried to get his son to rebel, thinking that this would be the way that he would express a kind of toughened character. But Edsel worshiped his father, and what he did was to absorb the abuse and sort of internalize the tension that was created. Edsel kept to his job in stoic fashion, even though he was often miserable. And I think if you look at his face in this photo, you can get the slightest hint of the kind of long-suffering quality that Edsel reflected. The sad conclusion to all of this is that I think under the pressure of this, Edsel developed stomach ulcers, very bad ones, and shortly thereafter, stomach cancer. And he died at a very young age in the early 1940s when he was also in his 40s. Henry Ford, his father, was devastated when Edsel died. I think all the more so because he realized at some level that his actions over the years had sort of contributed to his son's ill health and his demise. So, kind of thumbnail sketch of Henry Ford's career. Well, I think when you look at all of this, I think what is most striking about Henry Ford when you dig into it is the tremendous popularity that he enjoyed with the public during the long, long scope of his career. And this represented a very significant change in how businessmen tended to be viewed in American life. Older business tycoons like Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and the like were denounced by the public as robber barons. But Ford, although he was probably the first billionaire in American history, enjoyed a special bond of affection even a kind of love affair, I think, with a great American public, with ordinary Americans that really sort of transcended all reason. Henry Ford, I think it's fair to say, became a kind of genuine folk hero in American life. Moreover, it was interesting to discover, at least for me, that Ford generated a kind of promiscuous appeal to people all over the globe during his career. For example, socialists such as Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet Union admired Ford extravagantly. And in the 1920s, it was not a rare thing to see big photographs of Lenin and Ford side by side in Soviet factories. At the same time, Adolf Hitler revered Ford as well, and he modeled the Volkswagen on the Model T in German economy. In the United States, the business tycoon John D. Rockefeller, the big businessman, he acclaimed the Ford manufacturing operation as, his words, the industrial marvel of the age. But at the very same time, Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat who hated Rockefeller, by the way, backed Henry Ford in his Senate run in 1918. Leftist intellectuals such as Charlie Chaplin, Aldous Huxley, denounced Fordism, as they call it, the mechanized labor, the assembly line of Fordism. But at the very same time, in 1940, Roper did a survey of actual workers in American life, and those workers ranked Ford as the modern leader who was most helpful to labor, above Franklin Roosevelt, above the labor leader Walter Reuther. So what are the reasons for this spectacular popular appeal that Henry Ford had? Well, I think trying to sort of unpack all of this and discover those reasons tells us a lot about Ford, tells us a lot about his significance in American history. And at least for our purposes this afternoon, I think we can boil them down to three areas, three roles that Henry Ford played in his career that tell us a lot about why he is such a tremendously important figure in this period, who shaped, I think, not only the socioeconomic structure of the country, but the cultural, deepest cultural values that we have as a people. First of all, what I would stress is the first role is Henry Ford's role in promoting consumer culture and consumer values in the early 20th century. He did not develop this technology, obviously. I don't know, guys. Let's see. I don't know, it's just not going, John. Oh, there it came. Okay. All right. You got the magic touch here. So anyway, Ford as a kind of advocate for consumer values. This role that Henry Ford played, I think, placed him at the cutting edge of historical change in this period, because his pronouncement about the automobile as being a kind of key mechanism in this new culture of leisure and abundance and consumerism really caught, I think, the popular spirit in the early 19th century, when Americans were ready to be done with a kind of Victorian tradition of self-control, self-denial, thrift, all of those old-fashioned values. Ford believed that automobiles, like his Model T, pictured here with the famous winged pyramid logo that the Ford people developed, he believed that the automobile was key to developing a richer life for common people. And when he released the Model T, he said this, and listen carefully to his words here. He said, "I'm building a motor car for the great multitude. It will be so low in price that no man making a decent salary will be unable to own one. and able to enjoy with his family the blessings of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces. The enjoyment, the pleasure of the multitude. That's what Henry Ford was after, and that's the key insight, I think, in his consumer vision. This attitude inspired, for instance, the $5 day, some of you may have heard of, in 1914, when, in a kind of extraordinary, revolutionary pronouncement, Henry Ford said that his factories would start paying his workers $5 a day, which does not seem like much to us, but it doubled the wage of automobile workers by one stroke of the pen. Now, he did this, it's important to note, not so much as a reward for productive labor, but as a kind of trigger for consumption in this period. Because he, as he explained it in the typical plain language for Henry Ford, he said, I want to make sure that the men who make the Model T can afford to buy one. And that is the key dynamic here. Now, I think it's important to note that Ford saw consumer abundance as a way to liberate Americans from a traditional economy of scarcity in an earlier period. In his words, again, human demands are increasing every day, and the needs for their gratification are also. This from the 1920s. This is as it should be. Gradually, wives are released from work. Little children are no longer exploited for labor. Everyone becomes free to go out and find new products, new merchants, new manufacturers who are supplying goods to them. Now, a dramatic example, and this is one of the favorite things of mine that I ran across in doing this book, dramatic example of Ford's mindset in all of this came from something I found in the Ford archives. And it's an advertising campaign that they launched in the early 1920s. Ford's advertising team went out, a new ad campaign they wanted to launch nationally, and they came up to Henry Ford's office. The story went with the campaign. They put it on his desk. And they drew their cue from the inexpensive price tag of the Model T. And their original phrase was, buy a Ford and save the difference. Buy a Ford and save the difference. Well, the story went, they put that down on his desk. So Henry Ford kind of looked at it. He rubbed his chin. He was a man of few words. He went over to the window. He looked out the window for a while. And then, without saying a word, he came back, picked up a pencil, and he scratched out the word save, and he replaced it with the word you see here, spend. That one-word replacement, I think, speaks volumes about his thinking with regard to his consumer culture. Buy a Ford, said Henry Ford, and spend the difference. Not save it, spend it. And that one word, I think, really gives us kind of insight into what's going on here. So I think it's crucial for us to understand that Ford's productive endeavors, the familiar Henry Ford, all of that stuff is very important to be sure, but I think it's more important for us to understand that he's one of the very first people to articulate in a fundamental and convincing way a consumer vision of not only the American economy, but American life. He understood, I think, sooner than about anybody, that mass production depended on mass consumption. And that mass consumption is what you needed to get going. So, in the same way, I think that his other endeavors move things forward. What you see here is that the Model T, rather than just being a new mode of transportation, was a kind of vehicle for a new vision of the good life, as Henry Ford defined it. One of material abundance, leisure, personal contentment through purchasing, something into modern consciousness. So the legacy was not just a change in how Americans lived, but really a redefinition, I think, of the American pursuit of happiness and what it meant. So that's role number one. Role number 2 that I want to stress and talk about here for a while is that Henry Ford emerged in the early 20th century as one of America's first mass culture celebrities in American life. After all, if you think about it, the early 1900s was a period that witnessed the formation of a new kind of mass culture of entertainment in our country. Movies, amusement parks such as Coney Island, popular music halls, competitive sports teams and the like as part of this new culture of consumption. And Ford gained a kind of foothold, I think, in a lot of things that he would later do by focusing on one aspect of this new commercial culture of entertainment. We'll give this to the man with the magic touch here. Yeah, I don't know where. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, Henry Ford got involved with this new sort of commercial cultural entertainment with automobile racing. And here Ford, this is pre-Ford Motor Company, he was involved with the famous race car driver in this period, some of you may have heard of, Barney Oldfield. They used to call my grandmother that because she was a kind of pedal to the metal type of woman. Barney Oldfield was the most famous race car driver of the period, and Ford developed a race car prototype for him. And Henry Ford and Oldfield won a whole bunch of races, set a bunch of records up in the Detroit area with racing. Now, the reason this is important is Ford, A, got a lot of national publicity about this, but B, he also attracted investors to the Ford Motor Company because they sort of thought, well, if he's successful in this guy knows what he's doing, and it helped get the company off the ground. The story was that years later, Ford met Barney Oldfield again, I think it was in the 20s, and Henry Ford said, well, Barney, I guess we made each other's careers. And Oldfield had fallen on hard times by then, reportedly said, well, that's probably true, Henry, but if that's so, I did a hell of a lot better job of it than you did, end quote. Well, by the 19-teens, Ford had become a master manipulator of what's really key to this new culture of celebrity, and that is media publicity. Ford became a kind of expert at gaining the attention of a public audience by cultivating newspaper reporters and photographers, magazine editors, newsreel producers, and the like. And here we have a couple of photos. The one in the lower left is reporters that were called to the Ford offices in 1914 with the $5 day announcement. We're sort of waiting in the hallway to interview Henry after this revolutionary proclamation. The one in the upper right is a photo taken in the late 1920s when Ford went to the White House to consult with Herbert Hoover, and then came out a short time later to do a kind of press conference. And as you see, there was just dozens and dozens of reporters waiting for him. This became a kind of regular event in Henry Ford's life. Now, in particular, Ford gained a lot of publicity from his friendship with some very prominent people, pictured here. He became famously friends with Thomas Edison, pictured on the left, Harvey Firestone, pictured on the right, and the famous naturalist, environmentalist John Burroughs, who's sitting at the top of the wheel up there with Henry Ford. These four, from about 1915 to about 1925, went on what they called camping trips into the wilderness, except that they had very fancy sort of camping trailers they traveled in, and they were accompanied by carload after carload of newspaper reporters and photographers who would, they sort of put ropes up around the campsite, and the newspaper guys hung out there, and they sort of breathlessly reported these vagabond geniuses, as they called them, every snippet of conversation that they could garner, every utterance that was made, every activity, the menu items, everything went out into the newspapers. But there was also, I should note, substance behind the publicity here, because Ford actually became very close friends with these two gentlemen. He respected very much Harvey Firestone to the right. Firestone, of course, was the famous tire manufacturer that Ford reached an agreement with in the 19-teens to provide tires for the Model T, and they became close friends there. With Edison, I think it's simply fair to say that Ford idolized Thomas Edison. He saw the man who invented the incandescent light bulb, the phonograph, power generating system for bringing electricity into homes and businesses. He saw Edison as being a genius of the Gilded Age, one of the very greatest Americans in our long history. In fact, Ford idolized Edison so much, there we go, that in 1916 he purchased a winter home, and this is the Florida connection here, to Edison over in Fort Myers, Florida. The Edison home is sort of the Victorian style up in the upper right, and Ford is a kind of craftsman-style cottage right next to it. And for a number of years, these two sort of wintered for several weeks next to one another there. Well, by the 19-teens, this publicity surrounding Henry Ford, it's simply become enormous. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, who was no piker on this front, his daughter once said that TR wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Teddy Roosevelt actually complained that Ford had become a kind of P.T. Barnum, he called him, who was just promoting himself relentlessly in American life. But in the 1920s, the Associated Press Club of America said that Ford was the most advertised person in the United States. Will Rogers, the famous humorist, joked that Henry Ford was known by more people than Julius Caesar, Mussolini, Charlie Chaplin, Clara Bow, Amos and Andy, and George Bernard Shaw rolled up together. So what all of this demonstrates, I think, clearly on this point, is that Henry Ford was the prototype of the kind of business person as celebrity. The forerunner of people like Martha Stewart, Elon Musk, Oprah Winfrey, and a certain gentleman who lives not too far from here. Third and finally, Henry Ford's great popularity, I think, during his career sprang from his role as a passionate advocate of the common man. This populism, as I termed it in my book, in Ford, caused him, I think, to glorify common people, ordinary citizens of the United States, and he made their values and their well-being a kind of benchmark for what he thought was important in American life. The reason, for example, that Ford's two earliest automobile companies failed is that the people who invested in it were wealthy people who wanted to make expensive cars for elites to buy. Ford wouldn't do it. And as a result, the companies went under. What he envisioned was the Model T, which of course he got off the ground with his own company eventually, and he explained it very simply. He said, there are a lot more poor people than wealthy people in this country, and we're going to build just one good car for all the poor people, end quote. Now, Ford's populism with its financial or distrust of financial elites and its respect for hardworking citizens out there in the hinterland, I think it influenced everything in his career. It influenced the $5 day. It influenced his development of those agricultural developments like the tractor and the soybean, and a number of other things in his career. But in the interests of full disclosure, I have to say that his populism also took a disturbing turn in the 1920s, because it led to, quite directly, I think, what is sort of the black mark on Henry Ford's career, and that is his anti-Semitic crusade of that decade. Through the newspaper he founded, the Dearborn Independent, which published throughout the 20s, he launched a series of attacks on the Jewish influence on American life. Now, I think most of us probably associate anti-Semitism with sort of reactionary, extreme, right-wing ideologies. But what's kind of interesting about Ford is that his anti-Semitism sprang, I think, from his progressive populist principles. And it sort of worked like this. Henry Ford hated Wall Street, he hated big bankers, he hated wealthy financiers. And all of this is a direct legacy from the populist movement in the countryside, late 19th century. Well, from there, it was only a short step for Ford to begin criticizing Jewish bankers and Jewish financiers and Jewish businessmen. His pacifism, Ford argued in the 19-teens with World War I, for example, that big businessmen, big manufacturers lay behind modern war. Because in his mind, they manufactured armaments, they sold those armaments for a profit, so they promoted war in order to make money. And again, it was just sort of a small step for Ford to start concluding that it was Jewish manufacturers and Jewish financiers that lay behind all of this. So in other words, what I'm simply suggesting here is that Ford's populism mutated into a kind of bigoted belief that there was one ethnic and religious group that was preying upon poor and common average working people in this country. By the late 1920s, there was such an outcry about all of this that Ford was forced into a kind of public retraction and an apology, but not before his public reputation, I think, had been indelibly stained. But I should note that Ford's populism also culminated in a happier form. Excuse me. Coming off a cold here. Excuse me. I hope I don't lose my voice here. Let me try this. In the 1920s, I think Ford's populism found a better expression in the Henry Ford Museum, which he built in Dearborn in this period, in which he spent millions of dollars basically collecting antiques from an earlier age, the 18th and 19th century, to put on display for people to come see. What's interesting, though, is that they were antiques from common people, the sorts of things that ordinary folks would have had in their homes in the 1800s and the 1870s, artifacts of daily work and life in that period. And as a visiting journalist noted, he said a pewter bowl from the humblest kitchen in the colonies is just as valuable as one from the kitchen of George Washington at the Henry Ford Museum. So Ford's populism, very important as well. So the Henry Ford that I think is important, the essential Henry Ford, is really the product of these sort of innovations with consumerism, celebrity, and consumer values. However, to wrap this up this afternoon, I think all of these things converged in what was Henry Ford's greatest role as a figure of significance in American life. And that is, he was a mediator of historical change. Because I think Ford, throughout his life, successfully projected to people a kind of profound ambiguity about the world that he left behind, the world that he destroyed in many ways, and the world that he created, the new urban world of the automobile. And I think, like most people, he had a kind of commingled hope and apprehension about that shift from one to the other. And I think that ambivalence in sort of guiding people from the old to the new was reflected in the two institutions that dominated the last decade or so of his life. On the one hand, Henry Ford built the River Rouge plant on the Detroit River, not far from Dearborn. This is a plant that I think at the period it was built in the early 1920s was the biggest in the world. It covered 2 square miles, it employed 100,000 people there, and it produced at its height 4,000 cars a day came rolling out of it. But on the other hand, Henry Ford didn't spend much time there. His office he rarely went to. Henry Ford spent most of his time at something else he began building in the same period, a few miles away at Greenfield Village, which was right next to the Henry Ford Museum. There at Greenfield Village, on 250 acres, Ford built a reconstruction of American village life from the 1800s and the 1700s. People in period costume at Greenfield Village worked and they made products, candles, horseshoes, homespun clothing, as they would have done decades earlier. The village, maybe if you can read the tiny little captions on some of them, included things such as a farm, an old-fashioned machine shop, a corner drugstore, the home of Stephen Foster, Thomas Edison's earliest laboratory, a courthouse where Abraham Lincoln practiced law, a southern plantation house, and Henry Ford's own farmhouse, the one he'd been born in that I showed you earlier. And by the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of people were visiting Greenfield Village as a tourist attraction. But of course, they drove there in their automobiles. Now, the dichotomy of the River Rouge plant on the one hand and Greenfield Village on the other reveals finally, I think, that Henry Ford's special bond with millions of Americans came from the way he kept one foot anchored in a kind of reassuring way in the past, while confidently striding forward with the other foot into the present and the future. He helped guide his fellow citizens through a wrenching period of historical change through these comforting, mediating images that he was able to project. Because what you see is ultimately Henry Ford, the revolutionary manufacturer of the Model T, whose favorite hobby was folk dancing to fiddle music from the 19th century. Henry Ford, the disciple of the work ethic, who nonetheless exhorted people to consume. Henry Ford, who was the master of the River Rouge plant, but also the man who served as the mayor of Greenfield Village. And for vast numbers of people out there in America who were anxiously dealing with this new world, such a thing was a comfort. Henry Ford offered a powerful example of how to accommodate the past and the future, how to find contentment within the new order. He gave ordinary citizens, I think, a blueprint for prosperity and happiness in modern America, and they loved him for it. Thank you very much. So I guess we have some time now for questions, and anyone who wants to raise something, I'll try my best.
At the time that the Model T went rolling out, what was the state of the petrol stations or gas stations around to, so-called fuel that? I had read in the Wall Street Journal that that era was not government subsidized, unlike what's happening with charging for the electric vehicles.
Well, the petrol stations in the early 20th century, the first decade, the Model T came out first in 1908, they were few and far between, and they were pretty crude. And yeah, no joke intended, I guess. What I remember reading, though, from the sources is that actually the Model T and Ford's automobile was a tremendous boon to Rockefeller and the oil industry, because it obviously, in that same way that consumption precedes production in a certain way, they responded to the demand for this. And what you see by the teens is petrol stations are beginning to pop up with more regularity and franchises of them. And there was also, on a kind of related note, I think what they called the good roads movement that sprang up in the 19-teens, because roads, as you might imagine, in the early 20th century were horrible. They were dirt, and they're filled with big ruts. And one of the Model T's big attractions is that it was able to maneuver through these horrible roads. But by the teens, sort of civic-minded citizens around the country were beginning to launch campaigns to build good roads between cities and between towns and villages and the like. So I think the reason the car is so important, I think, is that it triggered all of that. The way we live, the way we arrange, the kind of economic stuff that we rely upon. The automobile is really at the heart of all of it, I think, or a lot of it anyway. Yeah.
I have a quick question. I never have quite understood why everything automobile related happened in Michigan. Were the laws favorable?
That's a really good question, and I was fascinated by that when I started doing this book. It seems now like back in the Korean War or whatever. The honest answer to that is it was an accident. I often thought that there was some kind of compelling legal or governmental or regulatory or non-regulatory business, and that doesn't seem to have been the case. What was the case, for whatever the reason might have been, is there was a lot of people tinkering with cars and combustion engines in the Detroit area. And I think it's just one of those happenstances of history that really is not explained. There was a guy named King, for example, that actually preceded Ford in developing the automobile. And he had a kind of prototype that he lumbered out onto the street, I think, about 6 months before Ford. And apparently Ford got wind of this and followed along behind on his bicycle for a while. But it was a big lumbering vehicle. It didn't really work out very well. But the honest answer is I think it's just an accident. No compelling economic reason or otherwise.
Could you talk a little bit about the Ford investments in Europe and Germany in the 20s and the 30s, and the ambiguities that they encountered?
Yeah, that's an interesting subject. Ford by the 1920s had expanded not only in this country. There were quite a number of Ford factories chunking out automobiles by assembly line. But there was a European division of Ford that had popped up by the 20s as well. And what became an object of some controversy, of course, was with the developing international situation of tension in Europe by the early 1930s with the rise of Hitler and so on. It got to be a very tangled economic and political question that Ford was involved in. Some people have argued, I think unconvincingly, that the Ford branch of, the European branch of the Ford Motor Company became a kind of conduit for money to Hitler and to the Nazi regime. And of course, they tie this into Ford's anti-Semitism and all of that. But while I did not dig into this extensively because I was mainly concerned with Ford's impact here, my impression is that what happened with Ford's European company during the war and the 30s, when heightening tensions erupted, is that essentially it split off from the Ford company and it was taken over by sort of the German people who ran that. And the Ford company in the United States, if it got any money, it was slowed to a trickle from what Ford was producing there. So I think it was a kind of ambiguous economic and political situation that, given Ford's anti-Semitic proclivities, got him into a certain amount of controversy at the time and since as well. So that's about the best I can answer on that front.
I read somewhere some time ago that there was some discussion with Edison and Tesla about having those early Ford cars be electric, and that there was some sort of conversation later with the manufacturers of asphalt for the roads that somehow impeded that discussion.
Yes. I don't remember the Tesla part, but I remember that Ford has some discussions with Edison about an electric car, because when automobiles were first coming to fruition, all of this wasn't set. Anything was possible. The best way I can answer that, I think, is that Ford pondered that for a while, but eventually decided that it wasn't really a go. And what most strikes me about that, at that issue and some others, is that Ford was full of ideas. He was sort of like Winston Churchill, I think, in that someone once said in any given day he had 1,000 ideas and 995 were nuts, but there were 5 of them that were really good, and the trick was to sort of figure out which 5 were good. Henry Ford, throughout his life, was designing all kinds of things with cars, about 90% of which never worked out, and I think the electric one was one of them. I think they simply decided that economically it was not feasible to do that, the technology was not there that he knew about, the combustion engine was being developed, and they knew that there was oil to run those engines. So I think that's what came to the fore. When the Model T was becoming obsolete, I guess it was about the mid-1920s, there was a huge crisis in the Ford company. How do we replace the Model T? Ford dug in his heels, wouldn't replace the Model T. They had to sort of drag him kicking and screaming into developing a new car. He went out and developed this insane prototype for a new car with a circular engine. And I think it had like 12 valves in it or something, and some crazy space age type of thing. And I think he pondered actually electricity at that time as well. But all of that, it just never got off the drawing board. So I think it's just that electricity technologically was a road that would be a lot harder to travel than with internal combustion engines. So I think it was the path of least resistance, as I understand it.
I've read that Ford was one of the few industrialists able to resist the National Recovery Act and the Blue Eagle program.
Yes, Ford hated the NRA with a passion, and he refused to cooperate with just about everything, including the NRA. He wouldn't go along with it at all. And in the 1930s, what happened is that there were a series of negotiations. Henry Ford was absolutely intractable on this issue. He would not be moved. But what happened is they had a stroke, the first of several strokes, and it sort of, I think, impaired him enough mentally that he wasn't quite as on the beam as he had been. And as he stepped a little bit to the side, the managers of the company, especially his son Edsel, who was still alive at that point, they quietly negotiated with the government over a number of things, I think including the NRA and the labor unions in particular, to reach a kind of agreement where people weren't getting killed in these bloody labor clashes up there as well. So by the mid to late 1930s, they sort of shunted Henry off, who was at Greenfield Village, having a great time being the mayor of the village, and his son and managers were sort of leading the company in a kind of rapprochement in certain ways with FDR and the federal government over issues like that.
Could you comment on his melting pot program for his employees?
About what now?
Could you comment on his melting pot program he had for his employees early on?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, a really interesting part I found with Ford's industrial career is that, especially with the assembly line, when it started in the early 19-teens, that was a response to absenteeism at the Ford factories in a lot of ways. And he thought productivity would go up with the assembly line, and indeed it did, but they had even more absenteeism with the assembly line that they had before. So the $5 a day was one solution to that. You pay people a really good salary and they will work even if they don't like to work very much. But the other way they moved was they began to hire more and more immigrants, particularly new immigrants, to work in the factories. Immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe in particular, Catholics and Jews, many of whom did not speak English very well. And what Ford put into place along with the $5 a day was a whole elaborate system of training and education for these industrial immigrant workers, where they would go to school every day, basically, and Ford hired people to teach them English, to teach them American values, American culture, American way of doing things. And when they finished, they got a little diploma, and off they went. And I found this hilarious picture because it's like something out of, the Middle Ages almost. It seems so long ago. The ceremony they had at the end of their graduation from these schools was the gentleman who had graduated from the school walked in, they walked up a little ladder, and then they went down into a huge paper mache melting pot. They walked in, they walked up a little ladder, they walked up the other side, and they walked out, and they were given American flags when they were in the melting pot. So when they walked out, they're all waving their flags. So he was an enormous advocate of the kind of melting pot ideology, and it worked pretty well for him.
Who quarterbacks the Ford company now? Is it family or non-family?
I think it was family up until about 10 years ago, because when I did my book, was it William Ford? It was like a grandnephew or something of Henry, I think. But I think they have new leadership now that is not of the family. I think 2 or 3 of the family members are still on the board of directors, but I don't think they're the head of the company now. I'm going up there in about 4 weeks. I'll check on that.
I've been a Ford dealer for 50 years.
Oh my goodness.
And it's interesting because Edsel had a bunch of kids, and he had William and Henry, and Henry ended up saving the company. The company almost went into bankruptcy because General Motors and Chrysler overcame them.
Right.
And Henry came back and saved them. And interestingly, William was a minor factory in the company, and William's son, William, is running the company now,
Is it really?
and has been very successful in running the company. They've really turned the corner, and they're doing extremely well. But it's interesting because Henry's son, Edsel, never made it to the top. Because William's son, who was a minor player in the whole game, William's son is now running the company. So it's interesting. And the company today is doing extremely well.
Right. Well, Henry Ford II was Edsel's son, and when old Henry was in very bad shape and died a few years later, there was a big crisis in the company about who was going to take over, and Edsel had died. And it's kind of interesting that Henry Ford thought that he could come back and run the company again, although he was really completely out of it. It was Clara Ford, his wife, and Edsel Ford's wife, Eleanor, I believe was her name, who got young Henry Ford out of the service in World War II and brought him back to become the head of the company. And Henry II, as you noted, really sort of saved the company in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and got it going again. So. Well, thank you for being such a good audience.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thank you all, and thank you again to our sponsor, Related. By the way, it was when we switched to automobiles, it certainly did help Standard Oil. It was John D. Rockefeller who became the world's first billionaire in 1914, and you know what the federal government's budget was then? $750 million. So it's the federal government's become the 500-pound gorilla in our economy today, not the leaders of industry and commerce. So thank you all for being here. We'll look forward to seeing you next week for a lecture on James Cash Penney. What a great name for a retailer. We'll see you then. Thank you all.